А, Большое спасибо, Юлия. Хорошо ли меня слышно?
Да.
Мгм. Мы договорились, что я буду читать лекцию по-английски. Все цитаты, впрочем, будут по-русски. И если нужно что-то пояснить потом по-русски, я не знаю, кому какой язык удобно, задавайте вопросы, конечно, потом на том языке, который удобен вам. Большое спасибо за приглашение участвовать в этом семинаре. И я перейду к лекции, которую я назвала Literary Representations of the 20th Century and Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory. As I was writing it, I realized that I need to say quite a few things about Stepanova before I really turn to the novel In Memory of Memory. And there will be, therefore, kind of three distinct parts in my talk. One will be just a general preface. I will try to explain the bigger framework for the project on which I currently work. And then we'll start with Stepanova and then move to In Memory of Memory. I will soon start sharing my screen, but maybe in a minute or two. So the lecture today is part of a work in progress, and this lecture itself is a work in progress too. In 2019, I started research for a project that I thought would look at the late Soviet period through the lens of the mythology it created of pre-revolutionary Russia or late imperial Russia. As my research and thinking about the subject evolved, its shape somewhat changed, and its chronology span became widened to include the post-Soviet period. I now conceive of this book-length project as a study in Russian cultural and intellectual history of the period from the late 1960s through 2010s. And it is tentatively titled, the project as a whole, Writing the 20th Century in Post-Stalin Russia. One of the distinct trends in this period, I argue, has to do with a gradual shift in the function of time that occurred toward the end of the 1960s, from the future as a temporal category in relation to which the meaning of the present was defined. The emphasis gradually shifted to the past. That gave rise to literature and film, both realist and experimental, that pondered the experience of the 20th century and the representational forms that could capture that experience. I will examine 5 major experimental Russian novels from these decades. And those 5 novels include Andrei Bitov's Pushkin House, Pushkinsky Dom, Leonid Gershovich's Price in either language, Pelevin's Chupayev и Pustota, Mikhail Shishkin's Venerian Volos, translated into English as Maiden Hair, and Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory. I probably will include a few films and poems focusing on the evolving representational strategies that over decades seem to respond to the challenge of writing the 20th century experience and will offer an interpretation of intellectual underpinnings of these artistic strategies. Today, I will focus, as you can understand, on the last of these novels and the last of these authors, Maria Stepanova's Pamяти, the novel that was published in Russian toward the end of 2017. Of course, its status as a novel is not unproblematic, and this is one of the topics I will address. I mean, the generic status of this book. I will address this topic later. However, I will start with afar, and I will look just briefly at where I will begin, looking back in the beginning of the Soviet period. So the Soviet project is central topos in all of the works I plan to analyze. It provides them with a narrative arc, and it frames their intellectual inquiry. The leading figures of the literary generation that was alive and active in 1917, that is the time when the Soviet era began, are frequent points of reference in the texts as well. That generation, the generation that I can tentatively call revolutionary, belonging to that epoch. So the generation itself developed variegated strategies of coping with the historical turmoil in which they were caught. And these strategies evolved over decades too. I do not have time to survey them today, but I would like to point out one that was most visible to the post-Stalin generation, even if in a range of simplified versions. The strategy of accepting the change and seeking to comprehend it in its own terms. And here I will start sharing my screen because I will start quoting. So can you see well that section? Okay, so let us consider Boris Pasternak, for example. In August 1925, as he goes through the intense creative crisis, he tries to explain in his letter to Tsvetaeva his resolve to turn to history, and more specifically, to things that have not been previously part of his knowledge of events, as he calls them, the gaps left by our amazing ignorance. And this is a long quotation. I will only quote in Russian what is highlighted in blue here. So he writes, интерес к упущенному, пополнение пробелов, оставленных удивительной нашей невежественностью по части всего, что не обняла в отрочестве наша метафора или рифма, воспитывает, горбит, стыдит, но зато и обещает связать бессвязно. В память нашу, I'm moving to the next highlighted section, в память нашу, как бы она ни была жива, вошло очень мало существенного в свое время, то есть такого, что сложило события и определило теперешнее время. Мне трудно, например, видеть в перспективе себя и свою. And moving further, это от того, что многое, бывшее нам природой, успелось не по газетному, а поистине истории. And finishing with this, мы рискуем быть отлученными от глубины, если в каком-то отношении не станем историографами. Just to summarize and reiterate what Pasternak is thinking. Pasternak thus sees this ignorance as the cause of his creative crisis, which prevents him from, as he puts it, seeing myself, seeing himself, and what is mine in the perspective. And he goes on explaining it precisely in terms of memory, which equals knowledge in his usage. He says, I closely paraphrase, that the memory of his circle includes very little of what became essential, what shaped the events and defined the present moment. He feels that this ignorance undermines his creative ability. What history and memory is he talking about? What did he miss in the past, right? Maybe our question as we read this excerpt. Of course, what he means is the history of освободительное движение, revolutionary or liberation movement, more narrowly, revolution of 1905 and what followed. What has come out of this sense of lacking memory or knowledge? Most immediately, these are his narrative poems on the events of 1905. 905 год, and Lieutenant Schmidt, in which, as we recall, and especially the first of these poems, personal memory is embedded in a richly researched panorama of the events of 1905. What follows later in Pasternak's career as a writer is his work on the memoir Охранная грамота, in English it's translated as The Safe Conduct, and eventually his novel Dr. Zhivago. Both texts arguably informed by the desire to put in the perspective the events of the Russian Revolution, a desire to understand that what shaped the actors of these events intellectually and socially. We see the same impulse present in Osip Mandelstam's very well-known piece of memoir, Шум временем, written even earlier. It was written in 23, published in 25. He opens it with a sketch of the last decade of the 19th century. It's a very famous opening. Я помню хорошо глухие годы России, 90-е годы. Их медленное оползание, их болезненное спокойствие, глубокий провинциализм, тихую заводь, последнее убежище умирающего века. What interests Mandelstam is how the revolutionary change emerged from that тихая заводь, quiet backwater of history. He emphasizes that memory is deprived of its sentimental flavor for him. And this is the second quotation. Память моя враждебна всему личному. Если бы от меня зависело, я бы только морщился, припоминая прошлое. Никогда я не мог понять Толстых и Аксаковых, багровых внуков, влюбленных в семейственные архивы с эпическими домашними воспоминаниями. Повторяю, память моя не любовна, а враждебна. И работает она не над воспроизведением, а над отстранением прошлого. So, what we see in both of these authors is a very distinct approach to the past, which sees memory as a tool for comprehending the present. And this is where the importance of memory and the past end. It's our guide to the present. The relation, yeah, we'll just move to the blank now for a while. The relations with the past that the post-Stalin generation, particularly literary generation, developed was different. Of course, the generation is too broad a category here. Whom I mean is specifically the people who were coming of age during the 1950s and early 1960s, and particularly the part of the generation that shaped the unofficial culture of the late Soviet period. For them, especially after 1968, the invasion of Czechoslovakia, reimagining the past and their own relation to it became the cornerstone of their agenda. Their tactic and their goal were, however, in sharp contrast to what we saw in Pasternak and Mandelstam. They are not interested in their own immediate origin, cultural origin, because they see no mystery there. Where are they coming from? From the culture of high Stalinism. And they are really turning their backs on it. What they seek is imagining themselves that what they were not, тем, чем они не были, a continuation of a broken line of cultural development, associated loosely with the late imperial period. This is the heritage they begin to rediscover and with which they want to claim affinity. This gives an impulse to intense mythologization of that same past with which Pasternak and Mandelstam engaged. However, that what Pasternak and Mandelstam saw in that past and what this new generation sees in the same years from the 1890s through the early 1920s is very different. What interests the post-Stalin generation is the past, in that past, is that what did not lead to the catastrophe and that instead promised cultural flourishing. And this kind of rethinking of what increasingly often is called Russian Silver Age, is very important for them, but they're trying to reimagine that culture as not conducive to catastrophe, as thus kind of removing or marginalizing the very thinking of the causes that produced that catastrophe of 1917. This relation to the past is not based on memory, rather it creates a demand for a new imaginary memory. The entire period of late imperial history becomes mythologized, and its artistic production acquires a special place in the pantheon of Russian cultural achievements. At the end of the Soviet period, this mythologized memory of the Russia we have lost, in quotation marks, became part of the new mainstream. And the Russia we have lost is the name of, at that time, a very popular film, documentary film, Россия, которую мы потеряли, that was produced in 1992. The post-Soviet generation, and now we're moving very close to the main subject of the lecture. So the post-Soviet generation inherited, it seems, both impulses, similar to what we saw in Pasternak and Mandelstam, and similar to what we saw in the post-Stalin generation. So they inherited both impulses, and they came dramatically, both of these impulses, they became dramatically intertwined in its own myth of origin. As that generation, the post-Soviet generation, matured, and we now come to the main subject of this talk, its preoccupation with seeing themselves and their futures through the lens of the past catastrophe became more pronounced, and the very vocabulary of past traumas resurfaced rapidly as the political climate in post-Soviet Russia deteriorated. Maria Stepanova became one of the chroniclers of this process, and her work can be seen as a chronicle of this process. And one of the authors who endeavored to deconstruct the manifold mechanisms by which memory shapes and distorts both the past and the present. In September 2011, Stepanova wrote an essay that is called "Разговоры в царстве мертвых," focused on a recently published volume, two-volume diary of Любовь Шапорина, a member of the Soviet cultural establishment, politically conservative and remarkably independent in her critique of all things Soviet. Stepanova ended her essay deliberately connecting Shaporina's situation with that of her own circle in Moscow of 2011. And this will be a long quotation. Ад это или аид, но то, что его ландшафт напоминает наш, а в просветах можно различить концерты, дачи и цветочные киоски, объясняет отчаяние, с которым сопряжено чтение этих дневников. So the diaries themselves cover the period from the revolution through the 60s. Okay. So Stepanova sees how it related to what is happening there and now. So I'll continue. Летопись последовательного вытеснения из жизни определенного человеческого типа страшна сама по себе. Но именно этот тип, пусть без всякого права на то, кажется нам своим. Люба Яковлева-Шапорина с ее прекрасным образованием, 5 языками, домашним европеизмом и любовью к искусству, живопись, театр, переводы, узнала бы себя в девушке из кафе «Жан-Жак», popular Moscow кафе, дизайн, фотография, журналистика, хотя бы по неготовности к катастрофе, по набору бесполезных знаний и желаний, непригодных для жизни на необитаемом острове. Ее страхи и предрассудки не дальнее эхо наших. Мнения и сомнения ее круга почти не нуждаются в переводе на новый русский. И наш обиход, усредненный, урезанный, искаженный, пытается помнить об ином, лучшем, не нами заведенном. А именно память о том, как надо, была для Шапориной неотступной мукой. Как никто, она знала, что ее жизнь прожита не так, ушла в другое русло, в сторону от закона и благодати, и в отличие от многих, никогда не могла с этим смириться. 100 лет назад ей было 32, она сидела на залитой солнцем пьяццоле Гарибальди, русское время, счастливое и никому не интересное. У нас пока тоже есть эта возможность и сколько-то времени, чтобы ею воспользоваться. So let me comment on what we see here. Well, just to briefly contextualize it historically, September 2011 is the beginning of the present crisis in Russian politics. If we want to date it back to a particular date, then of course it is 2011. It's just the weeks leading up to the announcement that Putin will run for presidency again, and that sense of this catastrophe looming in the horizon begins then in kind of modern post-Soviet Russia. It is a powerful projection, what we see in this exit. At the same time, the temptation to read one's own historical situation through the lens of a past catastrophe has its obvious shortcomings. It is an emotional gesture, but for my purpose, it is the last sentence in this quotation that has supreme importance. In case of Stepanova, an unclear but threatening catastrophe looming on the horizon fermented a rapid creative transformation and growth. It is in 2011 that most poems that would comprise her poetry collection, Киреевский, let me put it so, книга стихов Киреевский. So it is in 2011 that most poems from that collection were written, and Stepanova's essay, «Перемещенное лицо», displaced person, reads as an extended commentary on her work on Kirievsky, although its implications are broad. The title of this essay is a pun. Person, in this case, лицо, is a grammatical category, like in the first person pronoun. And the displacement refers to the conscious transfer of the I of lyric utterance to a voice, or indeed a self that is not the author's. Stepanova calls such selves subjects of poetic utterances, фиктивные фигуры авторства, fictive figures of authorship, whose existence is limited to the space-time of one cycle or one book of poems, a territory that exists according to the laws that are not entirely identical to those the author recognizes over himself. And this affords new freedom to the poet, she explains. And this is the quotation you see on the screen. I will read it. Я, poetic I, я, оказывается, тогда не актером, но камерой. Камер вдруг становится несколько, много, и направлены они не на тебя. Авторская воля сводится тогда к работе команды, обеспечивающей прямой эфир для эксперимента. Задача едва ли не техническая. Переключение камер, смена планов. Но если предположить, что все камеры работают, все голоса говорят, поют, кашляют, свистят, запинаются, один из них, видимо, принадлежит самому автору, но мы не можем с уверенностью сказать, какой. Если этот пучок или веник расходящихся интонаций будет существовать как текст, как единство, эксперимент можно считать удавшимся. Корпус написанного поэта представляется тогда чем-то вроде гигантской инсталляции со смещенным центром. И какое же счастье знать, что ты не центр, а радиус. So, Kirievsky, as a book of poems, became an experiment in a new vision and new hearing. In these poems, Stepanova was mastering the languages of 20th century historical traumas, the languages of loss, misery, and excludedness. For the title of the book, she took the last name of Pyotr Kirievsky, in case it's not obvious for some of you, a 19th century collector of folk songs, whose voluminous collection was published only after his death. It was the first comprehensive collection of Russian folk songs, and Kirievsky's name became emblematic of the enterprise of Russian folklore collection in general. He was an amateur collector, and he relied on many submissions from his contemporaries, also amateurs, who would often edit and correct the text they recorded, or even submitted their own imitations of folklore alongside original folk songs, as Alexander Pushkin, for example, claimed to have done. Stepanova had this premise in mind when calling her book Kireevsky. As an author, she writes her texts over the tradition, infusing it with a strain of experimental poetry and thus ensuring its transition into a new age. This experiment of speaking in voices about the world anticipates a гигантская инсталляция of her novel In Memory of Memory, Памяти памяти, in which Stepanova makes variegated approaches to memory and the past meet and intermingle. Stepanova's early stages of the work on In Memory of Memory coincide with the beginning of the actual catastrophe, Russia's annexation of Crimea and the interference in East Ukraine in 2014. Her seminal long poem Spolia, and I will explain the meaning of the title a little later, opens with the speaker reciting from the would-be digest of confused responses to her recent work. And this is the excerpt one. Она не способна говорить за себя, потому в ее стихах обязательны рифмы и фальсифицируются отжившие формы. Ее материал не хочет ей сопротивляться, дает поцелуй без любви, лежит без движения. Таких, как она, ставит на табуретку: прочти нам про друг прелестный. Из таких, как она, в советское время делали переводчиков, умеренных, аккуратных. Где ее «я»? Положите его на блюдо. Почему она говорит голосами? Присвоенными, в кавычках. У кого нет «я», ничего присвоить не может. У кого нет «я», будет ходить, побираться, подражать углу, коту, майонезной банке, и все равно никто ему не поверит. Пусть сама она выйдет и что-нибудь скажет, а мы послушаем тебя. Она не выходит. Это у нее не выходит. The motif of a lacking eye, whose place is taken by a multiplicity of voices, gradually gives way in this poem to an elaborate display of these voices gathered together from across time and space and transformed by this displacement. The voices coalesce and bounce off one another, and interspersed with them, there appear glimpses of human images whose voices are still waiting to be transposed and impersonate. Closer to the end of the poem, the reading from the familiar or seemingly familiar digest seems to resume, but it turns out to be dedicated to a different one without an eye. And this is отрывок второй. Она не способна говорить за себя, поэтому ею всегда правят другие. Потому в ее истории столько повторов и фальсифицируются отжившие формы. И не понять, откуда какая цитата из 30-го или 70-го года, потому что она цитирует все одновременно. И не чтобы напомнить, а чтобы наполнить дыры, что особенно жутко. Ее материал, ее мазы, алмазы, каменные пещеры, древесные леса, золотые горы, снежные барсы, пустынные розы, газовые потоки, которые так нужны мировой торговле. Ее материал не хочет иметь с ней дело, дает без любви делать с собой, что надо. Непонятно, чего ей надо. Где твое «я»? Почему его не видно? Почему за тебя говорят посторонние люди? Или ты говоришь голосами шутих и трусов? Выйди из себя, поставь этот словарь на полку. Она не выходит. Это у нее не выходит. So there's no mystery. It is Russia, the country, that appears here as a double of the poet. A country without an eye, whose possessions, carefully accounted for, along with events and voices of her past, seem to be stored in a giant repository and available for ad hoc repurposing in ever new combinations. As spolia, as building blocks of absolute structures. So spolia in the history of architecture is a term for materials of obsolete buildings that are being used to build new buildings. Right? The Russia of spolia is a country waging war in Ukraine, a war that flooded the public discourse with antiquated, seemingly long forgotten propaganda cliches, a downpour of quotes oblivious of their birth, time, and place. And of course, I'm talking about the war of 1415 here. This is the text from 2014. What could aligning oneself as a poet with such a country possibly mean? The grotesque overtones of this juxtaposition are evident. Stepanova's poet, with her professed belief in speaking in voices, confronts a caricature or a reflection in a possibly distorting mirror. Yet the effect of this juxtaposition is more complex. Both the poet and the country may be speaking in voices, and their shared history may be an explanation for that. But only the poet possesses a selfhood independent of these voices and knows where her voices and quotes come from and why. In Spolia, Stepanova tackles the boundaries of poetic self-expression by synthesizing voices hitherto non-existent in experimental poetry and by bringing these voices of various provenances in contact with one another. In one of the middle sections of Spolia, interspersed with its multiple voices, there appear glimpses of human images. We understand that these are photographs, not real people, that this not living people. That these people are probably have died long ago, and that the speaker lists them looking at the photographs as if drafting some kind of outline. And I quote, and this is April 3, I quote with some cuts from that part. Брошка у ворота, волосы стянуты в пучок. Бабушка моя, чуть старше, чем я, кормит белку с руки в подмосковном парке. Солдат одинок, пьет газировку с сиропом. Школьная форма, примерка, фартук, крылат, подол неподъемен. Под праздник дома и улицы в лампочках иллюминации. Пятилетняя мама с шелковым бантом смотрит. Щелк, щелк. This is the sounds of camera. Дом старых большевиков, две старухи на лавке, одна моя. Крым, 38-й, водопады курортниц в пестром. Какая? Игра в крокет на подмосковной даче. И говорят все радиостанции Советского Союза. Экспедитор, запутавшийся в цифрах. Медсестра, дошедшая до Берлина. 17-летняя нянька. Чистильщик ботинок из второго подъезда. Геолог после второй отсидки. Врач-гинеколог. Преподаватель архитектурного института. Какой-то Вася с Солянки. Сотрудница санэпидемстанции. Убитый на войне 20-летний лёдик. Его отец доброволец в разбомбленном эшелоне. Его мать, дожившая до самой смерти. Девочка, которая все это запомнит. За огромный праздничный стол 9 мая садятся все, настежь окна, работает радиоточка. И сама Виктория за столом сидела, синий платочек пела и Шуберт пела. Как будто не было смерти. The reader of Stepanova's In Memory of Memory would easily identify some of the characters and scenes in this outline. Side by side with the theme of speaking in voices, another theme appears, that of remembering those in whose voices the poet would never be able to speak, but whose images are also akin to spolia, the fragments of the past, whom the author wants to bring to life by puzzling together their stories. Is it possible? This is what Stepanova's In Memory of Memory, the question with which it engages. In her early essays, Stepanova was preoccupied with individual strategies of other authors to engage with the past. One of them in particular, Zebent, interested her in that regard. And this is this quote, a couple of quotes from an article on Zebent, с той стороны, заметки о Зебенте. То, чем он занимается, называется спасением утопающих, всего и всякого исключенного, вытесненного и вытесняемого, теряющего смысл, всех перемещенных и забытых лиц мировой истории, всего исчезающего от людей и народов до ненужных ремесел и газовых ламп. For Stepanova, this is an essential trait of authors who bear witness to epochs of destruction and obliteration, and it is Sebald, as far as Stepanova's literary sensibilities are concerned, to whose sense of purpose she relates, including ways his ethical impulse transforms the aesthetic. And this is the other quotation from that same essay. Если говорить о литературе, Себald выступает против тирании занимательности, на стороне всего неинтересного, заведомо лишенного права на читателя. То, что делает Себald, своего рода тихая, почти безмолвная революция. Мы видим, как рушатся этажи и сыплется снежный прах. Он не пытается убедить, что неинтересное – это новое интересное. Он не настаивает на том, что и должно быть скучно, как это часто бывает с его коллегами по цеху. Себald попросту убирает датчики скучно-нескучно с приборной панели и честно вспоминает всех, до кого в силах дотянуться в режиме общего дела. Его горе и его пафос в том, что понимание, понимание заслуживают все составные части тварного мира, и он сбивается с ног, пытаясь замолвить слово, картинку, цитату, намек за каждого из живших. This is one of the framing motifs of Stepanova in Memory of Memory, and Sebald's example looms large in the novel, but an equally important and competing one is reflected in her essay «Над важными гробами», also from 2013. Its title alludes to a line from Pushkin's poem «Когда за городом задумчив я брожу», and важные гробы of that poem are ancestral graves in the village, which lack pompous decorations and inscriptions. What such graves evoke in our minds is a sense of private, inconspicuous existence as the foundation of the world. A quote, number 7 from «Над важными гробами». Естественная склонность рассматривать историю как выставку достижений или последовательность травм здесь разом вытесняется историями другого рода. Сутки, простыни, утюги, фарфор, фаянс, пеленки, детская присыпка, колечко, дутого золота, нижние юбки, открытки из Горького, Чехов в издании Нивы, санки, торт Наполеон, профсоюзные взносы, звонить 4 раза, театральная сумочка, двушки, полушки, единый проездной, сентябрь, тетрадь для записи слов, масленка, мимоза, балет лампа. Над каждой могилой, как столб, как сноп, стоит невидимый и, может быть, сияющий, а может быть, лишенный всякого цвета и веса, объем бывшего. Высотой он, как мне кажется, до неба, небо на нем и держится. In Memory of Memory is a book that makes the tension between these two impulses central. So the impulse вспомнить всех, and then the other one, let the past be an invisible force of being, whose components one just cannot enumerate, and of which, if we can, we still can hardly make full sense of those lists. One can even say that these two impulses mark the beginning and the end of the author's or narrator's journey in Память и память, in Memory of Memory. In Memory of Memory starts out as a family story, something the author confesses she wanted to write from her childhood. Yet she admits already in the second chapter that from her young years, she felt uneasy about how ordinary her family members and lives were. And there will be a series of quotations from the novel, so this is number 1. В ранней юности это будило во мне неловкость, которую было сложно перевести в слова и стыдно осознать до конца. Она относилась, как бы это сказать, к сюжетостроению. Я вынуждена была признать, что моя родня мало постаралась, чтобы сделать нашу историю интересной для пересказа. Сюжетостроение, or the storyline, thus requires and acquires a different foundation. This is quote number 2. Книжка о семье получается вовсе не о семье, а о чем-то другом, видимо, об устройстве памяти и о том, чего она от меня хочет. Indeed, the plot of the book unfolds in an unexpected plane. In Memory of Memory becomes a sort of Bildungsroman, a story about sentimental and intellectual education of the narrator, who had once conceived of making a monument to the deceased, but discovered more and more obstacles to completing that task. From the impossibility to puzzle the stories of people together, from the isolated evidences, written or visual, to the realization that her inquiry into their fates make them defenseless vis-a-vis the curiosity of the living, who received access to their life stories. And this is quotation number 3. А у мертвых прав нет никаких. Их собственностью, обстоятельствами, их судьбы может воспользоваться кто угодно и как угодно. Их никто не защитит, с нас никто не спросит. In chapters of part 1 and 2, and the novel has 3 parts. So the chapters of part 1 and 2 of Memory of Memory are interspersed with what Stepanova calls non-chapters, не главы. In English translation, translated them as not a chapter every time. Comprised of letters from the family archive. These letters convey a peculiar sense of the loneliness of an old document in the middle of a modern narrative. A loneliness that stems, it seems, from the incongruity of the document's purpose, let's say a private letter, and the new context. Typical elements of Bildungsroman, such as the heroes, the author's travels, meetings with new places and people, with new things and ideas, are supplemented in the second part, in part 2, with a series of novellas about artists and writers, about their experience of treating the past and memory. In each of these novellas, as the reader eventually understands, there is something that resonates with the situation of the author of In Memory of Memory, in her quest for models of relating to the past. All these novellas together form an impressive gallery of case studies, among whose authors' heroes we see Rembrandt and Charlotte Salomon, Sebald and Mandelstam, Raphael Goldchain, Francesca Woodman, and Joseph Cornell. So the last 2 are American artists. Only having passed through this hall of mirrors in part 2, hall of mirrors in a metaphorical sense, so these mirrors, this other people's narratives or other people's ways of representing the past, and Stepanova was looking into the examples as into mirrors. So only after she's passed through that hall of mirrors, Stepanova's narrator becomes ready in part 2 to tell the story of her family, weaved from family lore, surviving letters, and her own research. Quite strikingly, that private story turns into an impressive narrative of the Russian 20th century, in which gaps and blanks are no less meaningful than hard facts. So the school of memory studies, so to speak, through which the narrator went prior to writing her family story, provides her with languages that help connect the Russian experience with the broad historical context of the 20th century. One of the early moments of the narrator's education in the novel is her reading of Marianne Hirsch's classic work, The Generation of Post-Memory, which she, meaning the narrator in the novel, recognizes as a travel guide to her own head. Путеводитель по собственной голове, Stepanova writes. Hirsch uses the concept of post-memory to describe the relations with traumatic memory characteristic of the descendants of Holocaust victims and survivors. For Stepanova, this term helps describe a much broader phenomenon that, she argues, penetrates the culture of the early 21st century. This is quote number 4 here. Воздухом постпамяти дышит весь современный мир с его консервативными проектами и реконструкциями, попытками стать great again, вернуть себе небывалый старый порядок. Экран оказывается двусторонним, проецировать на него свои страхи, надежды и истории, как выясняется, могут не только те, кто стоит по краям воронки. Воронка is the image of catastrophe. So not only those who immediately are connected to catastrophe, не только те, кто стоит по краям воронки, но и внуки и правнуки безмолвного большинства, которое дождалось нужного часа, возможности извлечь на свет собственную версию старинных событий. Россия, где круговорот насилия длился без устали, формируя своего рода травматическую анфиладу, по которой общество переходит от беды к беде, от войны к революции, к голоду, массовым убийствам, новой войне и новым репрессиям, стала территорией смещенной памяти немного раньше других. Двоящиеся, троящиеся, подернутые рябью несовпадений версий того, что случилось с нами за последние 100 лет, как слой непрозрачной бумаги, заслоняют от света настоящее время. And this is, you probably have read Hirsch's book, but this is basically the main argument that post-memory is something that that people who, let's say, whose ancestors were victims of Holocaust keep remembering, even though it didn't happen with them, it didn't happen in their lives, and they become so dedicated to memory, to remembering the past, that their own present becomes increasingly irrelevant to them. So that's why there's just composition in this quotation. This past заслоняет от света настоящее время. Okay. So thus, like Hirsch, Stepanova sees post-memory as a threat to the present and by extension future. And this is what informs the persistence with which she questions the value of the obsession with the past. The resistance of the past to reveal itself becomes one of the recurring motifs of a memory of memory, and that resistance is a lesson that the narrator eventually makes explicit. And this comes close to the end, almost at the end of the book, this quotation that Stepanova sums up the efforts to rediscover the history of the family. Если я ждала, что в конце путешествия для меня припрятана коробочка-секретик вроде корнеловских, so the reference here is to boxes, type of small installations by an American artist, Joseph Cornell. So, если я ждала, что в конце путешествия для меня припрятана коробочка-секретик вроде корнеловских, из этого ничего не вышло. Места, где ходили, сидели, целовались люди моей семьи, где они спускались к реке или прыгали в трамвай, города, где их знали в лицо и по именам, не стали со мной брататься. Поле битвы, зеленое и равнодушное, заросло травой. Это было как в компьютерном квесте, когда не умеешь играть, подсказки приводят к чужим воротам, потайные двери ведут в глухую стену, никто не помнит ничего. И к лучшему. Один поэт сказал, что никто не придет назад, другой, что забыть значит начать быть. And allusions here, никто не придет назад, is of course to Alexander Blok, and забыть значит начать быть is comes from a poem by a contemporary poet Mikhail Brons. Among the many models of the relations with the past and memory that the narrator evokes in the novellas in part 2, there is one that stands out. It is Charlotte Solomon's Life or Theater. So you see the title under number 6. Solomon, a German Jewish artist, was 22 when, in 1939, she was able to escape from Germany to France, where she continued to work as an artist until she was arrested and sent to Auschwitz, where she perished. Life or Theater, Stepanova explains, is a sequence of 769 gouache pictures in which images are interspersed with text and musical phrase. The subject of this enormous Gesamtkunstwerk is a family history, dramatic, tragic, and disturbing at many levels. Stepanova presents Solomon's work to emphasize its elements that specifically resonate with her own creative principles, in particular, its complex structure, but also Solomon's explicitly stated intention to allow the characters to sing and speak in their own voices, позволить персонажам петь или говорить собственным голосом. And this is what we see both in Stepanova's poetic work, but also in A Memory of Memory, where we, in parts 1 and 2, as I said, read real family documents included in the book. What is more, the subtitle of In Memory of Memory, Romance or Romance, is also explicated in the chapter on Solomon. Душещипательная природа, this is soul searching, sort of, not soul searching, different word, but this is the way Stepanova translates particularly German phrase in Solomon's own characteristic of the word. So, душещипательная природа работы Соломон поощряет читательское желание видеть в ней лирическое повествование, что-то вроде любовного романа. По-английски этот жанр зовется емким словом romance, который подразумевает не только неотменимое фабульное ядрышко, но и систему акцентов, подчиняющую все, что в книге не есть, главному любовному интересу. Это слово, впрочем, встречается в важной работе Фрейда, короткой статье 1909 года «Familien Roman» de Neurotica, которая в классическом английском переводе так и называется «Family Romances». Речь там идет об определенной стадии развития, когда ребенок перестает верить, что он такой особенный, мог родиться у своих заурядных родителей и сочиняет себе новых шпионов, аристократов, небожителей, воображенных по своему образу и подобию. Он считает себя жертвой обстоятельств, похищения, чудовищного обмана, романтическим героем, насильственно помещенным в интерьер реалистической пьесы. Neither Solomon's nor Stepanova's works are indeed, in the end, such romances. Despite an ironic hint in that direction, Stepanova makes at the end of part 2. And this is where this part where she looks at different examples of other people's work with memory. And so she summarizes what she feels at that point have been wrong about her project. Вместо респектабельного занятия, исследования или расследования, все, чем я занималась все это время, вдруг оказалось фрейдовским семейным романом, чувствительным романсом о былом. But as I said, in the end, that's not the ultimate definition of what Stepanova does. So, in defining Solomon's Zingspiel, Stepanova argues, and this is quote number 8 here, у этого текста структура и замах эпоса. Это поминки по исчезающему миру. Stepanova's romance, in quotation, has the structure and the sweep of an epic too. However, it is not a wake поминки for a disappearing world, but a wake for memory, hence the book's title. More precisely, for its particular cultural and textual forms that are products of the age of catastrophe. On the cover of In Memory of Memory, which I can show, if you can see it on the screens now, this is the Russian edition of it, and I'm showing the particular image. So on the cover of In Memory of Memory, we see a white china figurine missing a leg and parts of its arms. We learn from the book that such figures were produced in some German town between 1880s and the Second World War. In America, they received a nickname, Frozen Charlottes. That's, of course, another link to Charlotte Solomon. They were largely used for packaging, as the legend has it, as loose fill around goods, and thus were doomed to be chipped, if not destroyed completely. The survivors of the century, frozen Charlottes, become the symbol of the book, embodying the way, as Stepanova puts it, no story reaches us without having its hills chipped off or its face stretched away, and how lacuna and gaps are the constant companions of survival. So this is in Russian, ни одна история не доходит до нас целой, без отбитых ступней и сколотых лиц, лакуны и зияния, неизбежный спуток спутник выживания. The coda of the book presents the narrator unpacking a puzzle, which is kind of a symbolic scene, not a real puzzle, it's meant that. Unpacking a puzzle with such figurines, I quote. Я расплёнывала их одну за другой, и они лежали на обеденном столе редком, так что было видно все сколы, все вмятины, землю, въевшуюся в фарфоровые бока, пустоту на месте отсутствующей ступни, руки, головы. Головы, впрочем, были почти у всех. Некоторые сохранили носочки, единственную часть туалета, которая была им разрешена. В остальном они были голые и белые, словно только что появились на свет, со всеми своими увечьями. Замороженные шарлотты, представители популяции выживших, кажутся мне роднёй, и чем меньше я о них могу рассказать, тем ближе они становятся. So the celebration, particularly in the last line, in the last sentence, the celebration of an immediate contact with the past versus trying to tell a story about it marks the end point of Stepanova's Bildungsroman, which we can see as a point of saying goodbye to post-memory or similar memory patterns. The structure created by Stepanova in her book both preserves and deconstructs the working of a memory culture or cult that afforded the past the position of supreme importance for the living generations, thus constantly reinforcing the relevance of past traumas. So this is precisely what she's trying to argue against in her book. Whether or not this memory culture may indeed be fading away is a question that today's readers of In Memory of Memory can answer for themselves. Thank you for your attention and for your patience.
Thank you for this talk. It was fascinating, and I'm not entirely sure. I don't know if everyone has heard everything well, because I think we had some disturbances with the sound, but otherwise it was really fascinating. Do you have any questions, dear students, or reactions? I have a few remarks myself, but I would like to hear you talk first. I want to just do this so we can see everyone. Anyone? Have any of you read Maria Stepanova's In Memory of Memory, Памяти памяти?
Not yet.
Well, thank you very much, Irina, for this exploring of Russian contemporary prose. And what you said in the beginning, in particular, it was of great interest to me, because this shift between what you're exploring in your book, as I understood, the shift between what happened in the early 90s, the Russia that we lost, so all this mythologization, construction.
You can switch to Russian too.
Yeah, this construction of this myth of this beautiful late imperial Russia that was unaware of the coming catastrophe. And I really appreciated the way that you explained it, that I never had thought about it this way, that indeed it was deemed as a golden era, Zolotoy vek. It's really and in the publications of this period, in the late perestroika and early 19th, you find the term Zolotoy, golden age, these golden years, and indeed as if it was a time capsule, as if nothing happened after, or something happened but was of course, something happened, the catastrophe happened, but was absolutely unrelated. And I think this is also one of the reasons, or I don't know in which way you have to put it. Is it a reason or is it a consequence? That because this pre-1917 time was seen as a golden age, anything that followed was also for some of the observers in the years of perestroika and after the fall of the Soviet Union, seen as something coming from abroad, or coming from, not coming from Russia, or coming from another force, from another enemy. And I'm referring to all these narratives that that can be observed in the 80s and the 90s of this beautiful Russia that we have no more, because the Bolsheviks came, because the Jews came, because they killed, because they assassinated the big great Russian culture. And this is also the moment in which this great Russian culture is is made is seen as something unalterable. So something that can like fixed, like a monument. And you can see this in all this how do you say it in English? I'm so sorry, I have all the I'm speaking in tongues in my mind. All these theories, that I'm actually now working on these narratives of the assassinated Yesenin. So how this the story of Yesenin has actually been assassinated by the Cheka. It is not only something that, yes, happened in the 80s, but it is also a signal of, I'm taking too long to talk, but it is also a signal of a way of looking at the past. It says a lot about the way that this generation, or not everyone in this generation, of course, but some people in this generation looked at the past as something that had to be, fixed, monumentalized. And I think this point of view, this perspective, it is something that came from the Soviet culture, in which everything had to be put on shelves, with the right name on it, with the right stamp on it. Everything has to be materialized. Whereas, as you have explained, in even here in Stepanova's work, and this is what you have concluded on, the real past is the past in which you have those holes. You cannot materialize everything. And I think this is also a kind of, opposition also to this Soviet tendency, or heritage from the Soviet culture tendency of wanting to label everything. Absolutely, name everything, label everything. And because if you name and label everything, everything has only one meaning. Whereas if there's no label, if there's a whole, there can be many meanings. So this was a very long and very long remark, but it is very interesting because you have this evolution, and your subject in general of your book is absolutely fascinating, and I think it's really, you are right to look at this from this point of view, from this point of looking at time. I had a question, real long. I had a question, and yes, also I think it can be developed, but I will not do this now because it will make us too long. Also, in Memory of Memory, the way this novel works. So, for example, in the case of all those narratives, about the Russia that we have no more, the Russia that we lost. These are very often narratives that work as detective narratives, where you have to find the culprit. You have the catastrophe is seen as an assassination, for example, as a murder, and you have to find the culprit. So you gather, how do you say it? You gather evidence. But here, I think this the narrative strategy is different, and this is exactly what Stepanova said, if I'm not mistaken. That you cannot. There is a moment that you cannot find all the evidence, so you have to deal with the absence of evidence. So this was very interesting. My question relates to the reading itself. When I read In Memory of Memory, I read it in Russian. And I remember I read it, maybe I wasn't in the right mood or something, or maybe I wasn't reading in the right disposition, but I remember it really, it's like a flow. It goes like a flow, so you have to enter the writing process, and you have to really concentrate on it. And there's a moment when you can even, that's what I felt as a reader, you can drown, you can almost drown in this, verbal stream. And this is, I believe that judging from, I don't know, just the punctuation, for example, this is what Stepanova meant, because this is really a stream of, I don't know if it's a stream of consciousness, but it's a verbal stream to trying to catch what's buried, etc., etc. But the way you read it, you didn't read it. You read it following the punctuation, but you read it very slowly, and so it was comprehensible, and it was. It was luminous instead of this, when I heard you reading it, I didn't have this sentiment of drowning in words. On the contrary, and I think you are totally right, absolutely right in reading it like this. And my question is, how Stepanova's writing strategy, or her style, or her choices, writing choices, language choices, tell the reader how to read her book, how to read it. Is there a strategy? Is there something in her book, in her style, that tells you, the reader, to read it like you read it? So to read it, to decode, to slow the speed of reading. This way you also slow the process of recovering the memory. And on the one hand, I find it might be interesting to investigate it from the standpoint, from the point of view of the reader and of the reader techniques, but also because you said, and you quoted this passage in Stepanova, this book, she said, it is, as, I don't know the word in English, поминки. So like a funeral.
Awake.
Wait, yeah, like awake, absolutely, yes. Thank you. I knew this word. But it's like a discourse that you pronounce. So what does it mean? Is it like a discourse that you pronounce at awake? Has it to be read as a requiem, or has it something to do with other styles of wake discourses that you have in Russian culture? I'm thinking of Plach, for example, or etc. Or so you see what I mean? How her style invites the reader to enter the book slowly and calmly, and re-put in the right places all the punctuation, so that the reader is not submerged by this flow, by this. Here, my question.
Thank you. I will try to answer this, but I actually, while listening to the first part of your comments, I wanted to say that what you've noted as a very distinct earlier strategy that you associate with Soviet strategy of just kind of attaching a proper label to everything. And also to kind of this seeing that time capsule in the pre-revolutionary culture. This is actually what was the strategy in many ways of the early post-Stalin generation. So it's not just the Soviet product; it's product of unofficial culture as well. And if you read Bitov's Pushkinsky Dom, this is a topic that is present there. So that great Russian culture ended, but this is what made it great. I mean, this is what kind of gave final shape to it, and now it cannot be destroyed. So everything that happened afterwards is just kind of a history that is started from scratch. But it cannot damage the past. So it's present. It's something that I will actually discuss in my book as one of the mythologies of time that we see emerging in the post-Stalin period, and one of the ways of relating to this pre-revolutionary culture. So as for Stepanova, there are different people who read differently, and she, as a writer, actually I don't see any stream of consciousness there. It's kind of very clear, in a sense, language, but very long syntactic periods. So this is what I think contributes to that sense of drowning. And Stepanova's syntax, and this is also like all translators, at least English translators, have a lot of trouble with it. Because she avoids as much as possible all of the conjunctions, союзы. So where you would naturally put e and er, or so she, if possible, she just puts comma, 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 comma. Like English language cannot stand it. It's very, very odd. It looks, it doesn't look as a device, it just looks like a strangely shaped kind of sentence. In poetry, you can see it as well, but in poetry, especially more later poetry she wrote in 2010, she actually, because poetic lines are short, you can actually just not use punctuation and still keep all this syntactic segments recognizable, and commas are not there. But in the prose, she uses commas, yes, but she uses very long syntactic periods, yes. They are not very complex, so it's not like Lev Tolstoy. So it's not Tolstoy's complexity of syntax. It's just a very different type of syntax, which I think slows down the reading, because conjunctions, союзы, is what helps you connect when you see them in a sentence. They're kind of the signals for you how the sentence is structured logically. And when you don't use them, this making connections always fall onto you as a reader. So you have to be sure that you understand the connection between this the two parts of the sentence or the phrases that are part of lists of something as connected. So I think she actually embeds, her style embeds in it, this demand for the reader to slow down. That's at least how I read it, but I read it slowly everything. So I'm a slow reader overall.
What you're saying makes total sense because, as you have said, so the syntax itself asks a lot of the reader and demands, as you have said, that the reader participates in this wake.
Yeah, but I don't think it's a particular kind of Russian tradition of wake speeches. I don't think so. I think it's a very modern language. It's not very different from how she wrote essays, but because it's a large form, of course, and some of the thematic elements, of course, probably allow for this greater use of this very long periods, syntactic periods, one upon another.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Domenico.
Yes, I see the question. Let me open
Soviet mythologies
the
of
chat.
time.
But Soviet mythologies of time.
Domenico writes his first research memoir on Pelevin.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Dominica. So they are various. So I was not talking about them. The Soviet mythologies of time. I think I mentioned it in connection in the beginning, in connection with sort of distinguishing between the perception of time and memory let me see in the there was focus of the early Soviet and even still high Stalinist period. Imagine time that we live through is just is relevant to the extent it contributes to the future. Right, so this is where I think in the beginning I talked about this future as the most important temporal category versus past as the most important temporal category, and this is where I see the difference between the revolutionary period, high Stalinism, and even later Stalin's years, and even still the early 60s, the thaw period, where it looks like it's the future that is important for us, the people who live today. So we have a particular image of the future. We work on the image of the future. In other words, in our minds, this is what preoccupies us. What will be our future? Towards what goal we are working? And this is very real, and this is not only specific to the Soviet Union. If you look at all ideocratic trends like fascism, also in the early part of the 20th century, this is also a trend that is preoccupied with the future. So we do something, we make some sacrifices today for the bright future. And that idea of the bright future is very important. So the transition of the Soviet Union, I think, happens with the end of the thaw and with this crisis of trust to the state on the part of people who really wanted to formally separate themselves from the state in terms of like speaking of intellectuals, speaking of others, people who could not formally completely separate themselves from the state, but were leading those double lives of loyal citizens, loyal Soviet citizens, but at the same time, people who do not really subscribe to this entire ideological picture that is presented to them. And if you're an individual living in a quasi-totalitarian state, still in the Brezhnev times, you cannot conceive of the future. That's something that this picture kind of is, that remains in the slogans, like we're building communism and so on. But in people's reality, it's not so much present. And you cannot, as an individual, sort of build your own future. Future by itself is something that requires a kind of sense of belonging to a society, to society. It's not that you can, of course, set the future in terms of what kind of job you want to have and so forth, but this is not the future of a nation. Right? It's just your personal future. So, and what I see happening, however, like in contrast to the image of the future, the image of the past is actually something you can totally shape for your own use. And if you even a member of a smaller group, like Russian unofficial culture, it was just clusters of people here and there. But this is something that could unite them. A particular, just finding in the past something what you can relate and what you saw yourself continuing. So you don't want to think of yourself as the descendant of this high Stalinist culture. What do you want to inherit from it? Nothing. You want to find productive precursor, productive ancestor, the tradition that you want to kind of plug yourself into and continue, and that kind of whatever gap is between you and that tradition doesn't matter. You read these books and you can refashion yourself as the descendant of this tradition. Again, you can actually do individually. This is what every single writer and artist always does. Establishes particular relations with a range of past traditions. But for groups of intellectuals in the late Soviet period, that seemed to be also kind of a group project to find their past. But what is their future? There was no question. There was no answer to this. Right? So you cannot build your own future in a totalitarian country, no matter how bright you are. So that's probably what I meant in this particular talk about the Soviet mythologies of time. But of course, it's a huge topic. For my purpose, for my research, this distinction is important because it helps understand what happens in the early 60s and why the past becomes so important, and then going into the post-Soviet period. This is in part continuing, but also mutating as a type of preoccupation. Yeah.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
In this discussion, thank you very much. Very interesting talk indeed. And I had a couple of questions, and mostly that what actually, well, the first one was concerns mostly the relation between poetry and prose in Stepanova.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me, but because he started with the poetry, and it seems to me like I compared it also to Pasternak because he started with Pasternak. Then I had made some connections in my mind between her strategy of writing and probably coming from being she's not completely a poet, so she's a poet and also a writer, like in prose writer. So we can say that she had some kind of an evolution which brought her to writing prose writing. So, but my question is there, since there is this kind of question between, for Pasternak, it was a question between how to choose between prose and poetry. And then when he came up with his project on Dr. Zhivago, and also this project was something he wanted to explain it, or some kind of to justify this project, disconnecting it or something, trying to oppose it to poetry, saying that poetry is not capable of doing something that prose does. And at the same time, poetry has something of an impulse like primary impulse of something which is present in the prose in a diluted, some kind of deployed or unfolded way, which is not present in poetry. Which cannot be grasped by poetry, which cannot be exposed in poetry, etc. So, is there something like of an evolution in Stepanova in connection to this, in relation to this memory thing? So, is it about the memory? Because you started with those poems who present themselves, who display as some kind of a collection of objects. So, I mean, a collection of photos of of objects of her past, of her all that she saw when she was a kid, and all what the objects that are presented, actually probably objects that have history in themselves, but they're not supposed to, they cannot tell us anything. So unless the poet from the writer gets concerned or troubled by these objects, and then deals with them. So what about this kind of shift between poetry and prose? Is it something fruitful for you, or is it something that can be discussed in this sense? So something that lacking in poetry, or something that she would abandon. I mean, she wouldn't do this in poetry, what she does in prose, for instance, concerning this memory thing, because, well, I just formulated this way.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the, I think poets have write prose, and actually many poets write prose. Better to ask, I don't write poetry, I don't write prose, except for scholarly. Well, as a reader, and as someone who knows, for example, Stepanova's work very well, I think different impulses in the beginning when she started writing essays. They were even she's probably prompted by for prose you can actually be paid. For poetry you can't. It's not just by way of a joke to say this. We remember that issue goes back to the early part of the 20th century. I studied Twentieth, so I understand that prose is something that if you're capable of writing it in quantities, you can actually feel like a professional writer. I don't think this is the important thing for Stepanova. So I think there are several impulses. So initial was just to try it out, and she really wrote her very first piece in prose in 2010. And that was an essay on Stepanova, by the way, which was, I think, written initially for a kind of textbook that writers, poets of the generation, a textbook of Russian literature wanted to create. So it was a textbook written by writers, by poets. But then many of her essays were reviews of specific books. They do not look like reviews, they look like essays, but the prompt was that. So research. So when you respond to someone, to someone's book, to someone's writing, so this is one way you begin to write in prose. And I think it had to do with kind of how the perception of self changed in the context of of Russian post-Soviet culture, that she wants to be more vocal and better heard. And of course, prose reaches to times more people than poetry. So she's interested in very and highly experimental poetry, and the further, the more experimental it gets. So the audience of this type of writing is very small. And from what I understand, that was kind of a very important part of his thinking. That well, first, she as a poet has something to bring to prose, to how you write, how you conceive of what you can do with prose. And like Memory of Memory is a good example. Is it a novel? What type of narrative it is? Some people would describe it as just a very, very long essay. I disagree with that because I think it has a very complex structure, narrative structure. But still. So I think that for Pasternak, it probably was very similar. Now, for him, it was complicated in the 20s, going to 30s when he was writing Охранная грамота. He tried prose earlier, but it was more experimental prose. But this desire to convey in a more straightforward way but also to include in your in that piece that you write greater array of connections that will be approachable, that will be accessible to the reader. Of course, poetry can include a great number of connections in a short line, in a short stanza. But this is text that requires deciphering, as opposed to prose, that is a text that seemingly communicates its message in a more straightforward is not a good word, but in a more direct way. So I think for Stepanova, just embarking on this writing was a gesture of kind of, I want to be read by, let's say, thousands and not hundreds, and potentially, as far as in Memory of Memory is concerned, she from the very beginning knew this book will be translated. Right? So it was commissioned by a German publisher, and she also felt that that's a chance. And with poetry, it's much more difficult just to go across languages. I mean, she's been translated poetry into different languages, but of course, the prose will be read much wider in translation than the poetry. So in short, to me, it's the question of this very conscious interest in expanding the audience and just becoming a writer for not just a handful of people who are willing to read and interested in reading experimental poetry, but for the people with broad intellectual interests who are not necessarily even avid readers of conventional literature, fiction. So.
But since you mentioned the essay, because you don't agree that it should be, well, for me sometimes I think that the way to entitle the novel, well, Памяти, it seems to me that actually it's also playing already with this meta narrative. I mean, it's also calling into question. It's what you showed very well. So the way she calls into question what is memory. I mean, I think which is something that actually I found very interesting and very endeavoring, well, in her in this attempt, that she was not looking only for the memory, for this hidden memory or the lost past, and the way that we can reconstruct it and the way we can deal with it, but also the way that it's not possible to. I mean, the point of departure of her reflections was that it would not be possible to actually the conflict between these two impulses, or the two desires, conflicting desires that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk. At the same time was already predestined. I mean, not to succeed. I mean, she would not be able to succeed, and that's what makes her project interesting for me. I think it's just it's the way that she tackles the obstacles. I mean, she actually faces the obstacles all the time, and then she gets back to some kind of reflection, because the reflection is always provoked by an obstacle in this movement. And that this movement is not, because I've been reading, and I know people of his generation, even the young writers who always wanted to, I mean, this kind of post-Soviet desire to restore the past, or to find something in the past that was missed, or that was not preserved by the older generations, that is not discussed enough in the public sphere, or even in literature right now. So this is something I heard of a lot. So there were many people who started writing exactly the same thing that Stepanova does. But I think the kind of failure in all those attempts, because those people did not kind of get the fame or whatever, so they couldn't get to a certain level of writing and could be heard and so on. So I think that's interesting to compare and to see, well, actually the way she starts her journey. It's the way also the reflection on her journey, and the way that the limits of all this project. So the limits of this project and the way that it's kind of doesn't fulfill. She cannot exactly fulfill the desire, and even the desire is not actually quite delimited or quite defined all the time, because in several parts of her book she says that. So, and what you mentioned also with the way that probably people whose lives she was about to talk, she wanted to talk about, they were not actually, they didn't want this existence. I mean, the existence of the object probably just wouldn't be, wouldn't be ready or to be exposed, or wouldn't like to be displayed. So why do you have why do you have to continue with this pursue this kind of goal to bring everything at the surface, on the surface? So
yeah, I agree, and I think precisely because she was able to kind of set these two narratives side by side. So for doing this research on her family, and at the same time her reflecting on whatever makes people engage in this type of relations with the past. Like, why do we think that the past must be not opaque? Right? Why does it has to be transparent? Why do we need it? Why do we need this clarity in the past? And how is it possible in principle to achieve? Yeah.
Just a few remarks, perhaps like the last one. When you compare her to the oldest modernist attempts, so modernist projects, endeavors, and so what do you think that something from Zebold, for instance, or even we can also talk about Benjamin, or even Baginov, I don't know, that people who also work with objects or with some kind of just material objects that need to be that need to get meaning, or kind of multiple meaning, perhaps. So what do you think, what's the difference between those modernist tradition, or probably relating to the past?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I mean, again, Zebold is a writer she likes, but, and if he is modernist, okay, he is very late modernist. He writes at the end of the 20th century. I think for her, it was important to, on the one hand, yes, to have Zebold as that it's not a model, but as a writer whose contribution to this, to the ways you address the problem of memory. So she definitely recognizes, but she doesn't do anything similar to Zebel. That's also very noticeable. So for Zebel, it's quite it's very serious belief that this way of not thinking of the past, but this way of excavating of this form of archaeology in which you mix deliberately fiction and document is I mean this is a solution to the situation where past is is not easily accessible, right? So it's not easily accessible. You mix it with fiction. You kind of insert it. Maybe everything is fiction in his work. There's just maybe there's no no word of truth, but it's presented as documentary, and it deals with painful moments in history. And for Stepanova, this is kind of the end of the tradition with which she is in dialogue, but to which she doesn't want to contribute. She tries to do something else to that past and say, basically, let's exit this post-traumatic periods, kind of mentally. Let's free ourselves from this service to the past generations. And this is on the one hand, it's very bold, and it's very today, like in 2017, it read in a certain way, and today it reads differently. Just as Stepanova herself said in a recent interview, so we were thinking of ourselves as living in this kind of post-catastrophe period. And now we understand that we were living in pre-catastrophic, right? And that changes how we think of everything. But I still think that her dialogue is primarily with this forms of memory culture and cult of memory that kind of dedicates our creative effort to the past and to bring in past into the present. And maybe, she says, that's no longer what we should be doing. So that's my understanding of kind of this tension that we see in the memory of memory. I will do it, but let it be the last one, the last piece written in family history.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Mom.
There is probably someone else who wants to ask last question.
Можно по-русски задавать
Да,
вопросы?
Конечно, да.
Можно по-русски.
Все впитали в себя очень много информации и поэтических переживаний. Ну тогда, если ни у кого больше нету замечаний, вопросов, дорогие
Спасибо большое.
Ирина Даниловна, спасибо огромное вам за очень интересный доклад, за интереснейшую дискуссию. Мы были очень рады вас принять и просто счастливы и послушать. Надеемся, что это только начало и что вы к нам сможете когда-нибудь приехать в нашу солнечную Францию.
Хорошо, да.
Будем ждать выхода вашей книги.
Спасибо. Ой, это еще долго ждать. Я тоже
можно задать вопрос? Вы мне как-то говорили про проект русской поэзии, история русской поэзии. Это еще все в силе?
О, это не история русской поэзии, это статья о модернизме для большой книги, которая называется, ну да, это что-то вроде истории, да, Oxford Handbook of Russian
Вот,
Poetry.
handbook, да.
Да,
Это
я ее
же-
сдала, но это, знаете, там 40 человек участвует, то есть это
Я просто хотела узнать, это
долго
все
еще будет,
или
долго будет.
мечтой, да, и увидеть ли это свет. Окей, все понятно.
Да, но это там-то просто моя статья о поэзии модернизма, но вообще там очень много участников.
Замечательно. Не, ну это просто...
Поэтому выйдет это через 2, я думаю.
Хорошо. Просто тоже все ждем. Спасибо большое. Всем всего доброго. И-
Спасибо.
большое,
До
да.
свидания. Да, до свидания.
Спасибо. Всего доброго. До свидания.
Спасибо большое.